Good afternoon. I'm Anuj Mehrotra, Dean of the School of Business at the George Washington University, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this episode of George Talks Business. We are continuing our series on artificial intelligence, and I'm delighted to introduce my co-host for today's session, Dana Matthew, Dean and Harold H. Green Professor of Law at the George Washington University School of Law. Thank you for joining us today, Dana.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Anuj.
And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest today, Erin Egan, Vice President of Public Policy, Chief Privacy Officer for Policy at Facebook, and alumna of the GW Law School. Welcome, Erin. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really honored.
So great. So in the first two sessions on artificial intelligence in this series, Erin, we talked about the benefits and risks of AI from two different perspectives: research and public policy and digital equity. Today, we hope to explore topics associated with AI, privacy, and ethics. And we will get to this in a moment. But first, let me start by asking you a little bit about your career path and your current role as Chief Privacy Officer at Facebook. And maybe if you could talk a little bit about the most important parts of your job.
Sure. Well, thank you. And first of all, again, it's really an honor to be here as a graduate of the esteemed GW Law School. I hold GW in my heart, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So I've been at Facebook. This will be my 10th year this year. But my journey was a typical one for a law grad. I actually went to law school. I clerked. I worked at a law firm. I became a partner in a law firm. And then joined, again, Facebook in 2011. And it's really just been this incredible journey for me of continuous learning and evolution, both for the organization I lead and for our company. And I guess just to sort of take a step back, as a law school graduate, you might think I sit within the legal organization at Facebook, but I don't. As you said, I'm the vice president of public policy. And what's the difference? Well, it's an important one. In public policy, the role of my team is to review product and business proposals around data and data use and ask, what should we do? Not what do we have to do? What does the law require? What can we do? And so every day we debate privacy and data use questions, asking, what does it mean to be an ethical steward of people's data? In many ways, public policy is around ethics. And we refer to this conversation often internally as accountable data ethics. And this is about balancing moral problems as they relate to data. And the other big part of my job is shaping new laws. That's the role of public policy. Where is the law heading? How do we establish guidelines and laws that reflect changing norms and expectations? So that's the work of my team.
Erin, that's so exciting, that difference between policy and law. I want to ask you if you give us some examples of each of those and break them down for us. So you say, with respect to law, you're talking about where law ought to be, looking ahead. Yeah. What are some of the most important developments in new law that you're thinking about right now as Chief Privacy Officer?
Well, one of them is around the issue that you all have been talking about. One of them is around AI. We've talked, and you all have talked in your series about how important this technology is for our time, for the future. It has, the potential to do so many powerful and immensely helpful things to improve the world around us. And so then the question becomes, and things that we think about is, well, what should the legal framework be around AI? How do we ensure that the technology can develop, we can allow for innovation, but that we also recognize that we need to have a responsibility to do it right, to respect people's privacy, to respect people's rights. And so we've spent a lot of time, not just within Facebook, but speaking to experts around the world around when we think about responsible AI principles, which we have and we think a lot about, how do we think about turning that into law that companies and policymakers can implement? And so that's been a lot of what we've been thinking about. And I'm happy to talk now or later about sort of what those legal frameworks could look like that we think could be helpful to both enable innovation and the future good, while also recognizing that we need to do it responsibly.
We do want to hear about that for sure. Can I just pause before we do to hear what you think the policy developments have been over the course of time? What are some of the emerging issues in the policy debate on privacy that are important to you?
Yeah, and I think as you said in even the question, over time, it's such a evolving space. And one of the reasons I became so interested in this area, I've always been interested in the intersection of technology and consumer protection. So when technology meets consumers, and how do we protect consumers with new technology? And so I would say over the past decade, when we've been thinking, in privacy, there's been many questions around data use for advertising, for example. What are the appropriate controls that people should have around advertising uses? There have been many interesting conversations around location and the use of location information. And I think the main thing that we try to do in the public policy space, and the goal is we need to understand where people are with their use of technology, understand the expectations people have, give people controls over their use of data in a way that makes sense to them. And so when you looked at public policy, when you look to and how the law has evolved over the past decade, you see things in Europe, in Latin America, in the United States, there have been privacy laws that have been passed. And they're in many ways, they're focused on that, focusing on people, giving them rights to their data, giving them controls over their data, ensuring companies build accountable systems and processes to protect data. So in many ways, the law is catching up to the fundamentals around where privacy and data use are today. And now it's about that next generation of technology and what should the law look like to, again, catch that in a way that allows, again, technology to evolve, but there are new risks created with new technology. So we need to build on these existing frameworks. We need to build on them to meet the demands of the future.
So Erin, I think let me, if I may follow up on that, and I think put it into perspective, especially in today's date with so many current events that have taken place. Some of these things, kind of, if you could comment on the role that privacy has played. And some of the lessons that Facebook might have learned from some recent events and current realities, like the COVID-19 and election and the insurrection at the Capitol, or Black Lives Matter. All of these factors that you're talking about, where there is this fine lines between what the laws might be, what the ethics might be, and how Facebook might have to deal with things. If you could take us through some of that lens from what you have experienced and some examples there, that'd be great.
Yeah, and there's a lot in that question, and each of those areas we could talk at length about. I mean, I think that just taking a step back, we're a social network. And so society is represented on our service. And when we think about society today, we recognize that people are polarized. We see this in every day, all of us, as we're engaging with friends and family. And people have very strong feelings about things that matter to them. And that could be politics, it could be sports, their identities. And Facebook, our platform, it gives people the space to express themselves. And we want to facilitate that expression. But we're also focused on safety. So we have community standards that govern the rules of the road when people express themselves on our platform. And our community standards, they talk about respect and needing to respect. And the hope is that we want to create opportunity for people to build empathy and understanding and respect, while also balancing their right to speak freely about issues that matter to them. And so safety and community standards, that's a lot of the work that our policy team does. We have a whole content policy team that's focused on that. On the data side, which are with our data policy team, I mean, one of the things that's been really interesting, and I think it ties into the conversation that you all have been having around algorithms, is how can we foster fairness in algorithms, and how can we foster transparency? And let me take this last one, because I think this is interesting about it relates to the current events, and just making sure that people understand why they see what they are seeing on Facebook. So we want to make sure people understand how decisions are being made about them and ensuring that they have control over it. So many of the issues that we have faced have been around, well, why are you showing these people, and why am I seeing certain content? And a lot of this, again, our newsfeed algorithm is an algorithm. It's AI. And so what we've done, and to then to what you both use Facebook, in your news feed, you now can actually ask what in every right-hand corner of anything you see, whether it's an ad or a post, it's a feature that says, why am I seeing this? And we have models, algorithms, AI, for delivering ads, for delivering newsfeed, and they're trained on certain factors. And so, for example, if you watch a lot of videos, you're going to more likely see videos. If you don't, you like photos, you're going to more likely see photos. And so we want you to understand why you're seeing things. And so this idea of transparency around the algorithm, that's something that on the data privacy side, that is such a fundamental principle of our company is transparency and giving people control. So with your ads, for example, you can click on any ad on Facebook. Why am I seeing this? It'll tell you why you're seeing that ad. And then you can control that and say, you know what? I want to see less of these, or I don't want to see these at all from this particular advertiser. So that's the data issues. It's around transparency. It's around control. And that's in many of the ways how we're thinking about ensuring that people have an understanding that relates to some of the current events that you've mentioned.
There has been so much with especially some very positive things that come out from having that social media presence, where you are in a position to be without compromising the data, the privacy issues, where you're in a position to be able to help people track, for example, tracking in COVID-19 or in disaster areas and things of that kind, and being in a position to provide that information. Maybe if you could spend a minute to try and tell us a little bit about that and how that is done, and it still does not maybe compromise data privacy, that would be great.
Yeah, think about when the pandemic hit, we all were wanting to help. Industry, governments, public health officials, everybody, all of us wanted to figure out how we can be helpful. And one of the things that we know and was of interest to public health authorities was data about the spread of COVID and understanding it. At first, I can sort of talk about attention, because at first it was they wanted to understand where people were going. If there's a lockdown order, are people staying put or are they not? And, of course, that could be very interesting and relevant information. But we also know that that's sensitive information about individual location data, where people are going. And so we decided we're not going to share that information with public health authorities. But we were thinking, how can we be helpful? And is there a way to aggregate this information? Is there a way to create a data set in the aggregate that could understand mobility trends? So you could understand and look at the trends and see whether people were moving from the city of New York, for example, to the outskirts or not. And people were moving from different places. And so in the aggregate, in a de-identified way, we were able to share information. And that was really, really, that's impactful and helpful to them. But we're able to do it in a privacy preserving way. And that's just one example of the different ways that within COVID that we've tried to create data sets that are useful, but also protect people's privacy.
Erin, I want to stay with this current event topic for just a little while longer. You've talked about transparency with respect to what people are seeing. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about transparency with respect to the use of data. And of course, everyone's going to want to hear about lessons learned from the July 2019 experience with Cambridge Analytica. So what are some of the lessons learned about privacy from that experience?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Cambridge is such a defining moment for the company and actually for the privacy public policy world, because for us, we learned from Cambridge, and just a quick second of what Cambridge Analytica was. Cambridge Analytica was a third party that misused data that people provided to an app that they were able to access through our platform. And this app had shared data in contravention of our terms with Cambridge Analytica. And so what we learned is we had taken a lot of steps before Cambridge to protect data, to make sure people understood when you're sharing data with an app, and this app has its own privacy policy, and really spent a lot of time there in educating. But we realized after Cambridge that we had to take a broader view of our responsibility. And we learned that we had to do more to make sure that developers on our platform are doing right by people. And so in Cambridge, right after that, we started to provide greater restrictions on the platform and enhance the oversight of third-party developers who use our platform. So we changed the kind of information that people can share with the developer. We invested in teams that police third-party developers and how they're using data. And we took action against developers who violate those terms. And so that was a defining moment. But to me, most in terms of our platform and what we did in terms of data use and the restrictions, but it really, most importantly, it triggered a massive cultural shift at our company. And this, gets back to what we talked about at the outset, this idea of ethics in our culture, in our product, in our people, in our technology. We now embody this. And I think it was Cambridge where we said, wow, people are, we have such a optimistic view of how people will use data, and this misuse that occurred. We knew that we need to take a broader view and ensure that we're doing everything we can, even if it goes beyond what's legally required, to protect people's privacy.
So you made very good, interesting points there. You started actually by saying that public policy is really ethics, and now you're talking about some of the importance of ethics. I would love to hear when there are new products or new applications developed and new innovations occurring at Facebook, when is it that you are involved? When do you get to be part of it? Is it from the very beginning deciding this? And I'm always curious because people talk a lot about ethics, and it's a very complicated word for me because who gets to decide what is ethical? What are the limits, and who gets to be in that conversation to really delineate what can be okay and what is not okay?
Yeah, it's a really important question, that last piece. And let me just sort of I'll get to it. But just in terms of the process and how it works, I think for us, it starts at the top, the culture. So Mark and our senior leaders have made clear that protecting the privacy and security of people's data is fundamental to how our business works. It's a business priority. So that cultural shift is really important. But where the rubber meets the road, and you're alluding to this, is on product reviews. And we are involved before products launch. And so any new or updated product or feature that stores, that processes, that shares user data, it has to go through what we call a privacy review. And we have to do this before, obviously, the product launches, but even before the product or feature is built. People come to us, engineers come to us, product development teams come to us because they know they have to before it can launch. And the earlier they come to us, the better. And in terms of how do we review this, we take a holistic approach to assessing and mitigating risks. And the most important part of this process is external consultations. So one of the things that we've instituted is we have an expert group within the US. We have in Europe, LATAM, APAC, because remember, our products and our services are global. And so we need to make sure that we are meeting, because there are different standards, ethical approaches. What is right? What is the moral right thing to do? Context matters, cultures matter, history matters. And so we know that we have teams of different types of people that are part of this internally. We have ethicists, we have data scientists, we have policy experts, we have legal experts. But then we seek external feedback because we know that we need to in order to do this right. And it really is that holistic, combined set of work. And then what we also do, which is really important, is we survey people. We want to make sure that what we're doing feels meaningful to them. We talk a lot about meaningful interactions. And so we're also gauging from people before and after launch of products to see if we've done the right thing. But again, it's a process, it's a conversation, and it really takes that collective effort to assess risks and to decide on a path forward.
No, I appreciate giving us this overview for a very complex problem, obviously, and a complex thing. Let's switch gears a little bit, if we may, and I would love to hear a little bit about. I'm trying to look at where the status of AI is and what are some of the current innovative things that major companies are pursuing. So it would be great to hear a little bit about the innovation that's taking place at Facebook. Anything that you can key us in, what cutting edge AI applications that Facebook is developing or is using. That'll be great to hear some of that from you.
Sure, I'm happy to. In 2005, we created at Facebook, and you may have heard about this. It's called FAIR, Facebook AI Research, and it's this in-house AI research division that is dedicated to understanding and developing systems with human level intelligence and really focused on the longer term academic challenges and inquiries surrounding AI. And so it's been doing this applied research in the field of AI. And this research covers the full spectrum of topics related to AI. And I'm not an expert in theory algorithms or software infrastructure and hardware infrastructure. But one of the areas I do know a little bit about, and much of this is public, we have a page where we publish this research, but we prioritize a lot of work around our integrity efforts. So integrity meaning to keep people safe on our platform and to connect people to what matters most to them. So, for example, we invested broadly to build classifiers to find bad content. So you think of child exploitative images or terrorist content, and there's a lot of investment in terms of natural language processing, machine learning, misinformation, tampering, entity detection. There's a bunch of work just around integrity, because that's such a massive area for us in terms of some of the issues that you talked about, some of the dynamics. We don't want hate speech on our platform. We don't want bad images on our platform. And so we've done a lot of work there. And one of the things that we do is that we try to advance AI through open and reproducible research at scale. So we publish and open source our work, not only to validate our results, but also to enable others to build off of our advances and hopefully accelerate the world's progress to more capable AI. And I do have people on my team who are involved with reviewing internal research proposals from a policy and ethical perspective and thinking through accountable frameworks to make sure that when even we're doing research, we think about this in the right way.
So what I love about this format, George Talks Business, is that we can get you to talk not only about cutting edge business developments, but I want to return to the cutting edge legal developments you were speaking of earlier, right? So you said the law has not kept up. Privacy law has not kept up, right? Privacy law used to be built in informed consent. Well, that's outmoded and inadequate. It doesn't give the kind of protection that privacy law reform in the framework you started to talk about earlier might also give. Can you describe some of the cutting edge legal developments that you are hoping to see?
Yeah, thank you. And you're right. I mean, AI especially poses complex new challenges to existing legal frameworks. It's interesting. And there's been a lot of work, especially in Europe, with the European Commission put out a request for comment on some of these questions. And how do we turn responsible AI practices into law? And one of the things that we are seeing sort of percolate into interesting frameworks that we think are durable, is defining high risk AI and figuring out how to define that, because there is high risk AI that might be using sensitive information to be making decisions about people. You can imagine credit, you can imagine decisions that have quote unquote legal effects. And so looking at what that definition of that bucket of high risk AI is, so that regulation can focus on those AI technologies with the highest risk AI uses, it's a hard area, and we're really working to define what that looks like, because that is where you can imagine having a set of requirements around, well, maybe you need to have auditing. Maybe there needs to be some requirements there with that high risk AI, because that's important and we need that. And the other thing that's interesting is impact. So if you're familiar at all with the privacy regime in Europe, they have something called privacy impact assessments. It's a requirement. And so one of the things that folks have been thinking through is, can we build upon some of these requirements that already exist to provide greater legal clarity, avoid duplicative regulation, and maybe have AI impact assessments, self-assessments. So, could you require that companies have to perhaps assess the risk and provide that to a regulator? And is that a way so that regulators can actually come in and enforce when companies fail to properly conduct a risk assessment or properly mitigate the risk they identify? But just the exercise of assessing risk and doing that self-assessment, that is accountability. That is governance, and requiring companies to do that. Certainly for our company, we do that. That flows through the rest of the organization. And so it actually can be a very meaningful way to get companies that are using AI for a variety of different purposes, where, the law can't say, well, in every context, you need to audit. That may not work. That may not be necessary or workable in every context. So can we have a more balanced alternative structure of self-assessments so that companies are required to assess risk, report on that risk, and then regulators can come in and say, okay, let's have a dialogue about whether you've actually assessed this risk appropriately or mitigated the risk appropriately. And we think that's a really interesting approach and framework that would be workable and meaningful.
I wonder if I could ask a follow-up question, just because that self-assessment regime sounds like it could be risky in some ways for some populations or for some types of information. When you conceive of a self-assessment regime, do you think of one that has special protections for vulnerable populations, let's say children, or for certain sensitive types of information? You referred to hate speech earlier. What are the calibrated protections in a self-assessment regime?
Yes, and I think that the two things together, having requirements around, I use the word high risk AI, you use the word appropriately, sensitive, vulnerable populations, vulnerable uses of AI, that would fall outside sort of in this framework of a self-assessment. There needs to be some set of rules and requirements around whatever we define in that category of high risk AI, high risk uses, inputs. We can think about what that looks like. Then separately outside of that realm, where you're not crossing that boundary, then is where the self-assessments around AI risk, that could be appropriate.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, it's been such a pleasure hearing this conversation and about, as Dana said, both from the business perspective as well as from the legal aspect and the privacy issues. And of course, I want to ask one final question, because we are running out of time here. And really, a lot of our students both are interested in interning at Facebook. And in fact, many of the folks, even in practitioner world in the technology area, are interested in that. And certainly, we would love to hear also, of course, some guidance for them and from you, and as well as some ideas about things that you would use as Facebook, which are current research topics that we should be studying and maybe weighing in on to help companies like Facebook.
Well, thank you for that question. I'll break it into two. I think in terms of advice, I've always been really interested, as I said, in technology and consumer protection. And the best advice always is finding a field, a topic, whatever it is that interests you, because then you'll have. I mean, we've been doing this for a long time because we're passionate about what it is that we do. So for me, finding that area of interest, even if I didn't know anything about technology, I wasn't a consumer science major in college, but I knew it was interesting. It's constantly evolving. I like that. So I jumped in it, there's lots of stories about, when you're afraid, that means it's a good thing to jump into, right? What would you do if you weren't afraid is kind of my mantra. But the other thing I think is important is that a career is a jungle gym. I was a partner at Covington and Burling before I joined Facebook, which is a law firm some of you may know. I know the dean of the law school does. And leaving to jump to, at that time in 2011, essentially a startup-ish, it was, I was afraid again. What would you do if you weren't afraid? But knowing that it's a jungle gym, your career, you can go down and then you can, build something new. And I think many of us just think it's this linear path, and it isn't. And so that's always my advice is take advantage of opportunities. And when they're scary to you, jump. And I think in terms of research, your second question, listen, I think we're really investing a lot in privacy preserving machine learning. That is really interesting. And so for the technical people out there, how we can be improving. I mentioned for COVID, we do a lot of work around de-identification. How can we also just get the data, get the sensitive stuff, get anything personal out as we're learning? I think impact assessments I mentioned are really interesting. What is impact? What does impact mean? We talked about sensitive categories, vulnerable populations. How do we define high risk? How do we define what impact should be in each of those buckets? And we're always interested in ethical approaches to innovation and privacy and thoughts on it. I think there's so much research in this space of ethics and innovation and privacy that I know I'm always interested in hearing, talking, learning from folks who have thoughts in that space. So just some ideas.
Well, thank you, Erin. It's been a pleasure and an honor to have you on this George Talks Business episode here. And thank you, Dana, for really collaborating on this and making sure that this was a fascinating conversation with Erin today. So again, thank you all for joining us today, who joined us today. And I want to invite you to the next 2 episodes of George Talks Business in this series. Next week, we have a double header. We'll have 2 guests. On Tuesday, I'll be sitting down with Melissa Koide, CEO of FingReb Lab, to talk about how AI is transforming financial services. And on Thursday, I'll be joined by my co-host, Dean of Public Health School at GW, Lynn Goldman, for a conversation about AI and healthcare. Our distinguished guest then will be Dr. Daniela Witten, Professor of Statistics and Biostatistics at University of Washington, and the Dorothy Guilford Endowed Chair in Mathematical Statistics. Again, thank you for joining us today, and hope to see you next week. Thank you.